The table was filled with the aromas of fresh bread and wine as the disciples sat around Jesus. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by the lamps that illuminated the room. The mood was one of deep reverence and expectation, with everyone eager to share another sacred moment of Easter. Jesus, with a serious and contemplative countenance, leaned over the table. The atmosphere that had previously been one of joy and communion was now about to change. His eyes, piercing and serene, fixed on the disciples, who sat in silence, awaiting his words. "Truly, truly, I say to you," Jesus began, his voice deep and filled with subtle sadness, "that one of you will betray me." The announcement fell over the room like an unexpected thunderclap. The growing murmur of the disciples revealed their shock and confusion. Peter, always the most impetuous, looked at Jesus in disbelief. "Lord, it is not I, is it I, Lord?" Jesus made a gesture of calm, his hands raised slightly. "What I do quickly," he replied, not pointing directly at anyone, but with a sadness that shone through every word. Judas Iscariot, the same one who had carried the group's purse, looked at Jesus with an expression that was a mix of despair and guilt. "Master, is it I?" His voice trembled, a mask of uncertainty and fear. Jesus looked at him, his eyes reflecting a sea of compassion and resignation. "You have said it." The disciples began to look at each other, their bewilderment growing as they tried to comprehend the meaning of Jesus' words. Among them, there was a growing sense of panic and disorientation. Some murmured quietly, while others hunched over in silence, as if the revelation had left them speechless. The room seemed to be in a state of suspension, time standing still for a moment. The disciples, who had shared so many experiences with Jesus, were now faced with the disconcerting reality that one of their own had become a traitor. Judas, with a look of despair and resignation, rose from the table and left quickly. His footsteps echoed in the room, a solemn sound that seemed to mark the beginning of a turbulent evening. Jesus watched Judas leave with deep sadness. His disciples, still stunned, tried to process what had just happened. There was a collective sense of betrayal and a painful awareness that the evening would not only be a time of celebration, but also of anguish and uncertainty. The conversation in the room began to die down, and a heavy silence fell over the group. Jesus, with a look of compassion and firmness, tried to comfort his followers. "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me." With these words, he sought to bring some peace to the turmoil that was forming among the disciples. They turned to him, their eyes filled with doubt and unanswered questions as they tried to make sense of the betrayal they had just discovered. The evening continued, marked by a mixture of sadness and hope, as Jesus prepared his disciples for the events that would unfold in the hours ahead. The announcement of the betrayal had transformed the communion into a scene of painful anticipation, setting the stage for the crucial events that would follow in the Passion of Christ. The city of Jerusalem was in fervent excitement as the Passover approached, and the streets were filled with pilgrims who had come from all over to celebrate the feast. Among the many, a group of 12 men walked down a quiet street, carrying an air of mystery and reverence. Jesus and his disciples walked with a clear purpose in mind. They were heading to a place reserved for the meal, as they had prepared in advance. The setting was welcoming, with a large table set for the special occasion. Once they arrived, the disciples were led to the place prepared for the supper. The room was simply decorated, but there was a serene beauty in the arrangement of the plates and cups. The table was covered with a white cloth, and the scattered candles created a soft, welcoming glow. The table was laden with bread, fruit, bitter herbs, and a cup of wine, traditional symbols of the Passover celebration. As Jesus and his disciples took their seats, a sense of anticipation and solemnity filled the air. The disciples sat around the table, following tradition but also looking forward to what was to come. Jesus, taking his central place, looked at each of them with a look of love and meaning. "With great desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you," Jesus said, his voice thick with emotion. He blessed the bread and broke it, offering it to the disciples. "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." The disciples looked at the bread with a mixture of reverence and confusion. Jesus gently took a cup of wine, and as everyone watched, he pronounced a blessing. "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you." The disciples raised their cups, the wine reflecting the light from the candles. They understood that they were participating in something deeply meaningful, although the true meaning still eluded them. It was a moment of deep communion, and Jesus' words created a link between the past and the future, between sacrifice and redemption. As they shared the meal, Jesus spoke to them of a new commandment: "Love one another as I have loved you." He emphasized the importance of love and unity, and how this would be the hallmark of his followers. The conversation at the table was charged with mixed feelings. The joy of celebration contrasted with the growing tension in the air as Jesus made announcements and instructions that challenged his disciples' understanding. The anticipation of his departure and the act of humility and service represented by the washing of the feet were central aspects of that evening, preparing them for what was to come. The final hymn, a hymn of praise and gratitude, was sung by all. The music reverberated off the walls of the room, a reminder of the deep spiritual connection they shared. Jesus and his disciples ended the meal with a sense of anticipation and sorrow, knowing that what lay ahead would be challenging. As the last note of the hymn faded, Jesus and his disciples rose from the table, prepared for what the evening would bring. The atmosphere of communion and celebration gave way to an atmosphere of watchfulness and reflection as they made their way to the Garden of Gethsemane. The Last Supper, with its symbolism and teachings, had marked a crucial turning point in the lives of Jesus and his disciples. It was a night of profound spiritual significance, a preparation for events that would change the course of history. As the Last Supper drew to a close, the table was filled with the remains of the meal and the soft sounds of the disciples' conversations. Jesus watched his followers with a look of deep affection and purpose. The atmosphere was charged with a mixture of calm and expectation. Jesus rose from the table and, without a word, withdrew to a corner of the room where there was a basin of water, a towel, and a pitcher. The disciples, immersed in their own conversation and reflection, did not immediately notice the change in Jesus' demeanor. Their minds were now focused on a gesture that would speak louder than any words. He began to untie his outer garment and put on a towel, tying it around his waist. This simple but significant act marked the beginning of a gesture that would defy the conventions and expectations of the disciples. Taking the basin of water, Jesus approached the first disciple, Peter. The water was cool and clear, and the soft sound as Jesus poured it over Peter's feet seemed to fill the room with a new serenity. Peter, surprised and confused, looked at Jesus with an expression of doubt and embarrassment. "Lord," Peter said, "do you wash my feet?" Jesus looked at him with resolute calm. "What I do you do not know now, but you will know later." Peter, still stunned, tried to refuse the gesture. "You will never wash my feet." Jesus responded with a tenderness that transcended words. "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." Understanding the depth of what Jesus was trying to teach, Peter accepted the gesture, allowing Jesus to wash his feet. It was an act of humility and service that defied social and religious norms. After washing Peter's feet, Jesus continued to serve each of the disciples, the sound of the water and the gentle touch of his hands creating a contrast with the weight of the words and the tension of the night. Each gesture was a silent declaration of love and service, a practical lesson on how his followers should treat one another. When Jesus came to Judas, who had been identified as the traitor, the moment was charged with emotional complexity. Jesus, with a look of compassion and sadness, washed Judas' feet as he had done with the others. Judas, looking at Jesus, felt the weight of his betrayal even more accentuated by the gesture of humility and unconditional love. After washing everyone's feet, Jesus resumed his place at the table and dried his hands with a towel. He looked at his disciples, his expression revealing a mixture of satisfaction and concern. "Do you know what I have done for you?" he asked. "You call me teacher and Lord, and you say well, for so I am. Now if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you should do as I have done to you." The disciples, immersed in the depth of the act they had just witnessed, felt the weight of the lesson. Jesus' gesture transcended the physical act of washing feet. It was a lesson in service, humility, and love. The evening continued with a new perspective for the disciples. They had witnessed an example of leadership that defied all expectations and social norms. The act of washing feet became a powerful symbol of selfless service and unconditional love, a lesson the disciples would carry with them into the future. With the atmosphere now marked by a new understanding of what it means to serve, Jesus prepared for the events that would unfold. The washing of the feet was not just an act of service, but a preparation for the great demonstration of love and sacrifice that was about to take place. The Last Supper was unfolding with a tone of solemnity and reverence. The table, now cleared of the remains of the meal, still carried the aroma of the bread and wine, symbols of a moment of profound spiritual importance. The disciples, all gathered around Jesus, were immersed in a state of contemplation and expectation, little knowing that a cloud of sadness was about to hover over them. Jesus, with the serenity that always characterized his most critical moments, observed his disciples with a penetrating gaze. The atmosphere was charged with a reverent silence, interrupted only by the soft sounds of cups being moved and the gentle clink of utensils. "Truly, truly, I say to you," Jesus began, his voice deep and grave, "that one of you will betray me." Jesus' words, simple yet charged with immense emotional weight, penetrated the hearts of the disciples like an unexpected bolt of lightning. The murmur that followed was one of shock and confusion, a wave of disorientation that swept through the room. Peter, always the most impulsive and vocal, was the first to react. He leaned forward, his eyes wide and his tone urgent. "Lord, is it I, Lord? Who is the traitor?" Jesus, with an almost painful calm, looked at Peter and answered, "It is the one to whom I shall give the piece of bread after I have dipped it." Taking a piece of bread, Jesus dipped it in the sauce and, with a gesture that seemed simple, handed it to Judas Iscariot. The room fell into a deathly silence as eyes turned to Judas, the identity of the traitor now revealed. Judas, with an expression that was a mixture of despair and guilt, looked at Jesus. "Master, is it I?" His voice trembled, a mixture of fear and regret evident in his eyes. Jesus looked at him with a look that reflected a sea of compassion and resignation. "You have said so." The disciples, still stunned, began to whisper among themselves, trying to comprehend the gravity of what was happening. The atmosphere, which had previously been one of celebration and communion, was now enveloped in a sense of betrayal and desolation. Judas, visibly distraught and with a pale face, rose from the table. His footsteps were heavy and echoed in the silent room. He walked away, leaving behind a group of disciples who were still struggling to process the revelation. The silence that followed Judas' departure was filled with a sense of loss and sadness. The disciples, still in shock, tried to assimilate the magnitude of the betrayal they had just discovered. Jesus, with a look that seemed to reflect deep pain and understanding, tried to offer words of comfort. "Do not let your hearts be troubled," he said, his voice carrying an encouraging and firm tone. "You believe in God, believe also in me." Although Jesus' words were intended to bring a sense of calm and hope, the weight of betrayal and impending suffering hung heavily over everyone in the room. The revelation of the betrayal was a painful foreshadowing of events to come, and the atmosphere was filled with a mixture of grief and anticipation. The disciples, now engaged in quiet introspection, tried to find meaning in what they had just experienced. Jesus, for his part, prepared to face what was to come with the dignity and love that had always characterized him. The evening continued with a sense of urgency and preparation for the events that were to unfold. The revelation of the betrayal had marked a crucial turning point, paving the way for the agony and redemption that would follow. As the Last Supper unfolded, the atmosphere was imbued with a profound sense of spirituality and preparation. Jesus, having already revealed his impending betrayal and washed the feet of his disciples, was about to share a teaching that would become one of the pillars of the Christian faith. The table was now cleared and everyone was focused on Jesus, whose presence radiated a serenity that contrasted with the weight of the events that were approaching. Jesus took the bread, holding it with an expression of intense concentration and reverence. "Take, eat," he said, as he broke the bread into pieces. "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." The simplicity of the gesture and the depth of the words immersed the disciples in a new understanding. Bread, a common and essential food, now carried a divine meaning, representing the body of Jesus that would be sacrificed for them. Each disciple, with their eyes fixed on Jesus, received a piece of the bread. The moment was filled with reverent silence, a collective recognition of the importance of what was being offered. The transition from ordinary bread to a symbol of something so profound and sacrificial was palpable. After distributing the bread, Jesus took a cup of wine. With equal solemnity, he blessed the wine and, raising it to the disciples, said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you." The wine, like the bread, was a powerful symbol. It represented the blood of Jesus, which would be shed for the redemption of sins. The meaning of the new covenant, a promise of salvation and renewal, was a message that transcended words and touched the hearts of the disciples. Jesus passed the cup to the disciples, and each one had the opportunity to participate in this sacred act. The wine, now imbued with new meaning, symbolized union and communion with Christ. As the disciples drank, Jesus continued to explain the significance of what they had just experienced. "For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Jesus' words about proclaiming his death were a reminder that the supper was more than just eating and drinking. It was a testimony of faith and hope in the promise of redemption. It was a way of keeping alive the memory of his sacrifice and the certainty of his return. The room was enveloped in reverent silence as the disciples absorbed the depth of what Jesus had just instituted. The ritual of the Eucharist, with its symbolism of body and blood, established a new path of worship and communion with God. Jesus, with a look that mixed sadness and hope, made one final comment. "Truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me." The words, still fresh in the disciples' minds, were now imbued with a new context. The revelation of the betrayal and the act of the Eucharist were intertwined, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of a new one. The room was now filled with an atmosphere of expectation and solemnity. The Eucharist, with its profound meaning and ritual, had laid a solid foundation for the faith that was to follow. The disciples, still processing the events and teachings of the evening, were prepared to face the challenges that lay ahead, confident that communion with Jesus would sustain them. After the institution of the Eucharist, the atmosphere in the room was imbued with a deep sense of reflection and reverence. The Last Supper had been marked by intense and emotional moments, from the revelation of the betrayal to the institution of the sacred sacrament. Now, Jesus prepared to lead his disciples through a time of worship and communion. Jesus rose from the table and, with a gesture that seemed like a natural transition, led his disciples into the traditional Passover song. This song, known as the Hallel, was a hymn of praise and gratitude to God, recited during the Jewish Passover celebrations. The disciples, still immersed in the depth of the events that had occurred, began to sing the song with Jesus, The words of the hymn were an expression of praise to God for deliverance and divine care, and as they sang, the melody reverberated throughout the room, creating an atmosphere of spirituality and hope. Singing was not only a form of worship, but also a way to prepare the hearts of the disciples for what was to come. The music seemed to lift the spirits while also offering a moment of calm and unity in the midst of the coming emotional storm. After the song, Jesus led his disciples in prayer. He addressed God with fervent supplication, and the prayer was an expression of his deep connection with the Father and his understanding of the weight of what was about to happen. "Father, the hour has come, glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you," Jesus began, his voice filled with a deep sense of submission and surrender. "I have asked you to keep those whom you have given me, that they may be one, even as we are one." As Jesus prayed, his disciples stood around him, listening with a growing sense of awe and reverence. Jesus' prayer was not just a plea, but also an expression of his love and concern for his followers. He prayed for their unity, protection, and continued presence of God in their lives. Jesus continued to pray for those who would come to believe in him through the word of the disciples, asking God to make them one body in Christ. He asked that the divine presence be manifested in them and that they be a witness to the love and truth he came to bring. "The glory that you gave me I have given them, that they may be one, even as we are one," he prayed. "I in them and you in me, that they may be brought to perfection in one." The prayer was a moment of intense spiritual communion. Jesus expressed his deep understanding of the sacrifice he was about to make, and his intercession for his disciples and future believers was a reflection of his love and commitment. After the prayer, Jesus and his disciples rose and prepared to leave the room, heading for the Garden of Gethsemane. The song and prayer had served as a spiritual connection point and preparation for the dark events that were to come. The atmosphere in the room had changed, now marked by a sense of calm and determination. The disciples, their hearts touched by Jesus' words and actions, were ready to face what lay ahead. The Last Supper was over, but the message of love, sacrifice, and unity would continue to guide them as they made their way to the garden, where the next phase of their journey would begin. Night had fallen over Jerusalem, and the city was plunged into a state of apparent tranquility, in contrast to the inner turmoil unfolding in the minds of Jesus and his disciples. After the song and prayer, Jesus rose from the table with his followers and led them out of the house, heading toward the Garden of Gethsemane. The path to Gethsemane was lined with trees and bushes, and the darkness of the night was softened only by the dim light of the lamps and the stars that shone in the sky. Jesus walked ahead, his step firm and resolute, but his eyes revealed deep concern and sadness. The disciples, immersed in a state of introspection and reflection, walked in silence. The revelation of the betrayal and the intensity of the Last Supper still weighed heavily on them. There was a sense of uncertainty and expectation regarding what was to come. Jesus stopped at a point on the path and turned to his disciples. "Stay here, while I go over there and pray," he told them. His eyes were filled with a deep sadness and anxiety that the disciples were only beginning to sense. He led them into the garden and, leaving them in a relatively safe space, withdrew to a more secluded spot, taking with him Peter, James, and John. These three closest disciples were chosen to witness a moment of extreme agony and spiritual intensity. In the silence of the garden, Jesus began to pray, his voice murmuring in supplication. The atmosphere was charged with an almost tangible heaviness, and the darkness seemed to deepen with each word he uttered. Jesus turned away from his disciples and fell to the ground, his body stretched out in a posture of surrender and despair. "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me," he prayed, his voice full of pain and anguish. "Nevertheless, not my will, but yours, be done." Jesus' prayer was a reflection of his inner struggle and the weight of the sacrifice he was about to face. The cup he spoke of symbolized the suffering and pain that was coming, and his desire that this suffering might be avoided showed the deep humanity he shared with his followers. As Jesus prayed, Peter, James, and John, who were standing a little way off, tried to stay awake, but the weight of the night and exhaustion took hold of them, and they fell asleep. Jesus returned to them, finding them sleeping instead of watching with him. His look on them was a mixture of sadness and understanding. "So you could not watch with me 1 hour?" he asked, his voice heavy with weariness and disappointment. "Watch and pray, so that you will not enter into temptation." Jesus' spiritual battle continued, and he again went away to pray, this time with a deeper sense of resignation. The weight of impending suffering was evident in his prayer, but his submission to God's will was a testament to his faith and commitment. After a time of fervent prayer, Jesus returned to his disciples again and found them asleep. Their bodies were exhausted, and the deep sleep seemed to be a way to escape the tension and anxiety that permeated the atmosphere. "Sleep on now and take your rest," Jesus said. "Behold, the hour is at hand, when the Son of Man will be betrayed into the hands of sinners." As Jesus' words unfolded, the distant sound of footsteps and the glow of torches began to draw near. The Garden of Gethsemane, which had been a place of prayer and introspection, was about to become the scene of one of the greatest betrayals in history. The disciples, awakened by the imminent arrival of the soldiers and the rising tension, prepared themselves to face what was to come. Jesus, with renewed determination and a peace that transcended human understanding, was ready to follow the path his mission required. The Garden of Gethsemane, with its darkness and stillness, became the setting for a pivotal moment in Jesus' journey. It was a place of agony and submission, where Jesus' humanity and divinity met at a point of profound transformation. The night was deep and silent in the Garden of Gethsemane, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves and the distant echoes of the city. Jesus, secluded in a quiet space in the garden, was immersed in a prayer that reflected the deepest agony and anguish of his soul. He had withdrawn from his disciples to seek a moment of intimate communion with God, away from the presence of his sleeping followers. Jesus knelt in a secluded spot, away from the prying eyes of his disciples, and gave himself to a fervent and anguished prayer. His words were low, but charged with an emotional intensity that resonated in the silence around him. Each word seemed to carry the weight of a monumental decision and the depth of his suffering. "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me," Jesus began, his voice choked with pain and despair. "Nevertheless, not my will, but yours, be done." The cup Jesus spoke of symbolized the impending suffering and sacrifice he was about to face. It was a symbol of the weight of the crucifixion and the temporary separation from God that he would have to endure. His prayer was a reflection of the inner struggle between his desire to avoid pain and his unwavering submission to the Father's will. As Jesus prayed, sweat began to break out on his forehead, mingling with tears of anguish. The scene was one of profound human suffering, a contrast to the peace and calm that usually marked his times of prayer. The garden, which was normally a place of tranquility, was now charged with palpable tension. Jesus' prayer was not only an expression of personal pain, but also an intercession for the well-being of his disciples and all who would come to believe in him. His anguish was a reflection of his concern for the impact his death would have on them and on the future of humanity. After a time of intense prayer, Jesus arose and returned to his disciples, only to find them asleep. The heavy sleep of the disciples contrasted sharply with the agony that Jesus was enduring. His expression as he watched them sleep was a mixture of sadness and resignation. "Could you not watch with me 1 hour?" Jesus gently rebuked them. "Watch and pray, so that you will not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Jesus, aware that his disciples were struggling with exhaustion and anxiety, turned once more to prayer, unable to escape the depths of his own anguish. The weight of sin and responsibility was upon his shoulders, and his prayer continued to be a struggle between his humanity and the divine mission he was about to fulfill. As Jesus prayed, an angel from heaven appeared to strengthen him. Although the heavenly presence offered divine comfort, Jesus' suffering remained a deeply human experience. He knelt again, the prayer becoming a plea for strength and courage to face the suffering that lay ahead. "Father," he prayed once more, "if this cup cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." Jesus' final determination was clearly visible in his words and actions. He had accepted the path he was about to take, knowing that God's will was more important than any personal desire to avoid pain. When Jesus returned to his disciples again, he found them sleeping for the second time. The night was drawing on, and the signs that the moment of betrayal was approaching were becoming increasingly evident. The garden was about to be invaded by soldiers and officers, and Jesus' journey was about to take a decisive turn. Jesus, now with an expression of resolve and acceptance, knew that the time had come. The prayer in Gethsemane had been a moment of deep spiritual struggle and total surrender to the divine will. Jesus' submission to the Father's will was a testament to his faith and courage, and set the stage for the crucial events that were to follow. The Garden of Gethsemane was enveloped in a tense silence, interrupted only by the distant sound of soldiers' footsteps and approaching lanterns. Jesus, after his intense prayer, knew that the moment of betrayal was approaching. His expression, marked by pain and determination, reflected the gravity of what was about to happen. The disciples, still immersed in a deep sleep, were awakened by the sound of footsteps and the voices of an approaching crowd. Jesus, with a resolute look, knew that his arrest was imminent. He stood up and went to his followers, who were still dazed and confused. On the horizon, a procession of Roman soldiers and temple officials, led by Judas Iscariot, approached. Judas, the traitor, was about to play his part in the plot that would lead to Jesus' arrest. With a kiss, a sign of affection that had now become a symbol of betrayal, he approached Jesus. "Hail, Rabbi!" Judas exclaimed, greeting Jesus with a kiss. This gesture, initially a sign of respect, became the mark of betrayal that would be remembered for generations. The soldiers and officers, now aware of whom they had come to arrest, moved in to capture Jesus. The scene was charged with a sense of inevitability and tension. Peter, ever the impulsive one, reacted quickly. In an act of desperate defense, he drew a sword and cut off the ear of the high priest's servant, named Malchus. "Stop! Don't do this!" Jesus commanded Peter, his voice calm and authoritative. He touched the servant's ear and healed it instantly, a final act of mercy and love in the midst of betrayal and chaos. Jesus then turned to the crowd, his voice ringing with quiet dignity. "As if I were in prison with robbers, have you come out to me with swords and clubs? Every day I was in the temple teaching, and you never arrested me." With these words, Jesus acknowledged the injustice of the situation and the betrayal that was taking place. His willingness to face arrest without resistance was a testament to his acceptance of the fate that had been foreordained. The disciples, frightened and disoriented, began to retreat. Fear and confusion took hold of them, and, not knowing what to do, they fled for their lives. The scene was marked by hopelessness and a sense of loss as Jesus was led away by the soldiers. The soldiers bound Jesus and led him out of the garden, and the road to the city was now a parade of betrayal and injustice. Torchlight illuminated the path, and the figure of Jesus, though wounded, stood out with unperturbed calm against the chaos around him. As Jesus was led away to trial, the shadows of the night reflected the gravity of the moment. Jesus' arrest was a prelude to the suffering and crucifixion that were to come. But even in the face of betrayal and injustice, Jesus' dignity and purpose remained unshakable, setting the stage for the sacrifice that would bring redemption to humanity. As Jesus' arrest progressed and he was led through the dark streets of Jerusalem, the city seemed to be plunged into a heavy silence, broken only by the sounds of chains and the footsteps of soldiers. Jesus' journey to judgment was not only a physical journey, but also a spiritual and symbolic one that would resonate through the ages. The disciples, scattered and frightened, began to gather in small groups, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. Peter, in particular, was consumed with anguish and fear. He had pledged his loyalty to Jesus, but when he saw the arrest, he had turned away, fearing for his own life. The weight of betrayal and his own denial was beginning to weigh heavily on him. Meanwhile, Jesus calmly made his way to judgment, his mind and heart prepared to face the suffering that lay ahead. Judas' betrayal, Peter's reaction, and the scattering of the disciples were all reflections of human frailty and the difficulty of maintaining faith in times of crisis. The disciples' reflection. The disciples, gathered in a safe place, were in a state of shock and confusion. They reflected on Jesus' words and actions, trying to understand the deeper meaning of the events they were witnessing. Judas' betrayal and Jesus' arrest were not only tragic events, but also moments of profound spiritual reflection. Peter, tormented by his own fear and denial, struggled with the reality that despite his love and devotion to Jesus, he had failed in his commitment. His heart was heavy, and guilt began to take hold of his mind. The contrast between his promises of faithfulness and his actual actions left him in a deep crisis of conscience. The significance of the arrest. Jesus' arrest was not only a moment of injustice and pain, it was also a pivotal point in the narrative of redemption. Jesus, with his quiet acceptance and dignity, was fulfilling the prophetic and messianic role that had been foretold. His willingness to face imprisonment and suffering without resistance was a testament to his divine mission and his commitment to God's will. Jesus' imprisonment symbolized the injustice and betrayal that humanity often faces, but also the acceptance of suffering as a means to achieve a greater purpose. Through his willing surrender and suffering, Jesus was paving the way for humanity's redemption and salvation. Lessons of the night. The events of the night were full of profound lessons for the disciples and for all who would reflect on them. Judas' betrayal highlighted human weakness and the complexity of individual motivations, while Peter's denial revealed the fear and insecurity that can overwhelm even the most devoted. Jesus' acceptance of suffering and imprisonment, on the other hand, offered a model of courage and faith in the face of adversity. His willingness to face suffering with dignity and submission to God's will was an expression of unconditional love and commitment to the mission of redeeming humanity. As the night wore on and the path to judgment unfolded, the meaning of events began to unfold, revealing the depth of Jesus' sacrifice and the hope it would bring to all. His imprisonment and suffering were the prelude to the redemption that would come through his resurrection, and reflection on these events began to shape our understanding of faith and salvation.